Hi everyone, I'm Héctor Hoyos, the Director of Modern Thought and Literature. Very pleased to welcome Jonathan Beller to our first event of the year, with many thanks to Amy Potemski and Nancy Child for organizing, to Jonathan for being here, and for everyone who is tuning in from around the world and in California to participate in this opening event. A technical recommendation for folks, I would recommend you use the panel view as opposed to the speaker view when we're all interacting. Otherwise, go with gallery view, and you might want to hit that button that makes invisible people who are not with their videos on, so you can have more of people and a little less of empty slots. All right, we're making do with the Zoom format. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to share some program announcements. We're also going to circulate these in writing in our newsletter, but we couldn't wait because these are exciting announcements that we wanted to share with everyone. I'll start with our recent novel, Cam and Bo, by Maria Chisos, our recent alumni. It's being published right now. This month it's coming out, so stay tuned for that. And she was also selected as a Dean's Fellow for the Department of Art and Art History this year. So congratulations to Maria, excellent news. Meanwhile, Omnia Nader, who is joining us from Philadelphia, was awarded a Mellon Fellowship at the Library Company of Philadelphia at their program in African American history. She's there in residence for the year. Also, 3 of our advanced students, Melanie Leon, Calvin Chong, Luz Jimenez Rubalcaba, have received fellowships, not 1, not 2, 3, from the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity for this academic year. Antonio Lopez, our first-year MTL student, was featured in the Stanford Daily and the Daily Post and other media as he's running for the council in East Palo Alto. Congratulations to all of them. I'm also very pleased to share news about the new faculty members of our committee in charge, who have accepted joining us and will contribute to the life of the program intellectually. They are Shane Denson from Art and Art History, Eileen Robinson from Theater and Performance Studies, Wendy Salkin from Philosophy, and Daphna Sur from East Asian Languages and Cultures. I welcome all of them. I'm looking forward to working with them, and I'm sure that our students are looking forward to getting to know them better. It's great for an interdisciplinary program to have such a distinguished interdisciplinary committee in charge. Great. About our speakers, Jonathan Beller is one of my intellectual heroes. I'll put it out there. And one of the pleasures of serving as a director of a program is you get to interact with your intellectual heroes. And I hope that other folks will be as enthusiastic about his thought as I am. I first read his 2006 book on the attention economy, which was really eye-opening. At the time, Jonathan spoke of the cinematic mode of production. I think, and I know from his later work, that he had to rethink this very quickly in the ebb of something like Web 2.0, and the ways in which cinema just became integrated to everything that we do, case in point, the medium in which we are conducting our intellectual pursuits today, right? McLuhan's The Medium is the Message. Oh, we are so past that. The cinematic mode of production showed how capitalist exploitation carried out via the capture of our sensoria, of our senses. It is a very compelling argument that continues to be generative in a number of fields. He then went on to produce in 2017, The Message is Murder, Substrates for Computational Capitalism, another book I highly recommend. And here, what I'd like to highlight and read a little bit from The Message is Murder is the way in which Jonathan Beller integrates literature narrowly construed, right, into his interdisciplinarily pursuits, okay? So I think this is good for all of us who are trying to work with literature in an interdisciplinary fashion. And he goes of all writers to Jorge Luis Borges. There's a number of authors that he comments. But this reading is quite brilliant and close to my heart. It is a revision of The Garden of Forking Paths, a short story by Borges that's very well known. And let's see what Jonathan Beller does here with the story. Referring to his, I'm quoting, referring to his own part as a spy for Germany in the Info War, the protagonist Yu Tsun, who is one of the German agents Madden has the good fortune of an opportunity to kill, remarks about his own intelligence activity. Beller cites Borges. I didn't do it for Germany, no. I care nothing for a barbarous country which imposed upon me the abjection of being a spy. I did it because I sensed that the chief somehow feared people of my race, for the innumerable ancestors that merge within me. I wanted to prove to him that a yellow man could save his armies, unquote, the Borges short story. And see how the reading unfolds, just a tiny bit of this. Beller. The contradictory implication that Yu Tsun honors his again, quote unquote, innumerable Chinese ancestors by struggling against proto-Nazi German racism in a way that, by cruel irony, supports the German Reich. At the time of the writing of this story, the then current German Third Reich was organizing a Holocaust, in no way mitigates the multiple imperatives of these codes. Rather, in making Yu Tsun's negotiations of race, power, and abjection parallel to Madden's, we see coded bodies caught in an informatic meshwork organized by and operative in a matrix of codification processes that overdetermines their options and drives them in ways that, quote unquote, no one can know. And I'll leave the reading of Jonathan Beller aside for now because we get to hear him. And I'll just welcome you to MTL, Jonathan. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Hector, thanks so much. I really appreciate your reading. I've actually never had anyone comment on that section of the book, and in a way, I wish you would read my whole talk because you read it better than I will. But thank you, and thanks also for the invitation. I'm really honored by it, and thank you to Amy Potemski and also to Nancy for the support and their efforts in the organizational process as well. I do appreciate that. And thank you all for everybody else in this webinar who has shown up. That's really kind of you. And I know that we're all experiencing a kind of webinar exhaustion these days. So the fact that you're here also really, I'm very grateful for. I hope after I speak, I'm gonna do a couple of different things, not that different, but I'm gonna go through a couple of different modes of speaking from some slides, reading a little bit from the new book, and then talking. I hope that you will sort of think about the questions you might have. I might not be able to answer all those questions. In fact, I doubt that I will be able to, but I'll be really happy to receive them. And I will sort of try to incorporate your questions and concerns in my present work and future work. I really learn a lot from these occasions, and so I definitely treasure feedback. Yeah, let me switch screens for a second and just see how this is going to work. I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay. Yeah, so that's not properly centered. Let's see. I'm missing the control here. Does anyone know how to like just make this into a slideshow?
Right there, the one that looks like, if you move your cursor to the left slightly.
Thank you.
Not so far to the left. Right, and the next one over, the next icon. That one, yep.
Thank you very much. Okay, pretty good. So that's this is the forthcoming book. And as I mentioned, I'll be reading something from it in a little bit. I just wanted to set out for a moment the kind of the lineage of the thinking. Not because I expect anyone to know these works necessarily, but just because I feel like they're very loosely a series, or they mark a development of the thinking, which I think might be useful in sort of processing what I want to say today. So Hector mentioned the cinematic mode of production, and I mean, the key insight there was that cinema brought the Industrial Revolution to the eye, right? And we had a technology which began an industrialization of the senses and the sensorium, and actually transformed the labor process profoundly, moving it into screen-mediated extraction. And as Hector said, I really did have to rethink that to some extent with internet, but in another way, from cinema, I felt like we were able to anticipate what the internet would become, actually a more intensive extraction of our attentional and cognitive capacities, which kind of changed the definition of what labor was, and also raised real questions about social organization and social movements, what it might mean to amalgamate labor or attention differently in order to posit a different historical trajectory, right? I mean, if everything was being subsumed under capitalism, revolution necessarily meant a reorganization of that process of subsumption, a kind of reverse subsumption of human capacity in order to transform political economy and sociality. So Acquiring Eyes, which was a book that was written in the Philippines when I was teaching there, was an answer in a way to some challenges that were put to me that were very important about the kind of top-down approach of my analysis, which used kind of the dialectic, one could say, in order to imagine what the strategies of containment were by dominant or hegemonic social form. So Acquiring Eyes, the question of Philippine visuality in the world media system, looked at insurrectionary artistic movements, cultural movements, and actual revolutionary war as a way of thinking about the challenges that were waged in the visual against the encroachment on the visual by Spanish colonialism and then US imperialism. And this was, to me, a really interesting engagement. And there were a lot of registers of visual practice, which in a way were compensatory for a failed nationalism, the incapacity for nationalism actually to win the revolution. As people probably are aware, the Philippines did wage its own revolution against the Spanish in 1896, which was brokered by the Americans, the US in 1898, and pretty much behind the scenes, the US bought the Philippines from Spain and stole the revolution. And so this process led to a lot of cultural ferment and dissonance, but within that space where the visual was becoming increasingly more important, visual practices started to emerge, which were really practices of liberation. So the book was very much trying to look at some of those things and think about, and also recognize that and this is why I'm bringing it up now, that the key codifications in media practices, in cultural forms, whether it's CIA propaganda, the novel, or Hollywood cinema, they're the result of contestation, right? Sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we just think that some brilliant person writes something or does something, but in fact that they come out of a history of struggle. And it became really important for me to think about the way in which struggle informs social form, and in the current work, also technical form, technological form. So as Hector mentioned, the most recent book is called The Message is Murder, Substrates of Computational Capital. And it was an answer to McLuhan, right? And the idea that the medium is the message. Because I guess the insight of that book, which is developed in the one I'm going to talk about in a second, is that that because the media are fixed capital, all messaging ultimately is styled for capital accumulation. Not that everything that we say or do is fully extracted, but that's the general logic. And so the whole messaging system results in kind of the murder on a geopolitical order. 2 billion people living on $2 a day, genocide, and all of the things that I'm sure many of you in MTL are very, very aware of and very, very cognizant of. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later. So the notion of substrates of computational capital was also a recognition that computation was running on a substrate, but that substrate was ultimately the bias. That in a way, you and I and everyone else that we may or may not know, most of whom we don't know, and the bias itself are becoming the substrates of this system of computation. And that's where the world computer picks up and develops that argument in some detail. It also has a relationship to synthetic finance and derivative finance and Randy Martin's notion of the social derivative. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. And I wanted to mention that the next one, and then I'm going to be done with this, is a book called Economic Media for the Decolonization of Money. Because as I'll try to make clear here, part of what's happening is we have the development of technical forms and media forms are actually also the development of monetary forms. And I see computation and information as being on a continuum with the ramification process of capitalism and its colonization, its granular colonization of the life world. So if that's the case, which is what I'm going to talk about a little bit more today, then one of the spaces we have to address that problem is in protocolization, right? The protocolization of media, but also of its lockstep integration with finance. So I'll say more about that in just a minute. Okay, let's try to figure out how to stop sharing my screen. All right. So I think what I'll do now is I'll read a little bit and then talk a little bit more from a few slides, read a little bit more and then talk. So that's what I have planned. If it takes too long, I mean, I've asked Héctor to tell me to be quiet at an appropriate moment. So I'll try to be about 30 minutes from now. But if it goes on much longer than that, I'll just stop or someone will stop me. So everybody can hear me okay? Great, thank you. The slow nuclear bomb that is the COVID-19 pandemic is but a case in point in the terrible unfolding of what one may hope is still prehistory, manifest as racial capitalism. It is a consequence of the conversion of the global demos being relegated to noise, to the poor image, that's stereo, to volatility by the global compute. The virus is not just information on a strand of genetic material and should not, as Ed Cohen warned us years ago, be treated fetishistically, as if it were itself the cause of global suffering. Viruses are everywhere. The global pandemic is symptomatic of world systemic failure on many fronts: healthcare provisioning and access, economic inequality, agribusiness, social hierarchy, racism, etc. Individual bodies are made precarious by a matrix of financialized information that differentiates among us while externalizing whatever else might be left of our pre-existing conditions that could all too briefly be summed up as our real interests, or even our ecological concerns, our connection to the bios in the broadest sense. We are subjected to and by a continuous for-profit reformatting by the various systems of mediation that overcode us as problems to be solved, including by the regimes of all the estates, the fourth estate that is the press, and particularly a fifth estate that has in fact absorbed all the others for its own calculus, namely computation. We observe that the reigning global calculus of profit, though invented by no one in particular, everywhere seeks to extract our value and mostly benefits those who believe in theory or in practice that they are shining examples of a superior race. Those who have almost unlimited access to the social product and to us, to our information, to our time. How does this sense of superiority, of the greatness of our oppressors come about? From their harvesting the outputs of the rabble and their self-satisfied accession to the violence necessary to keep us down. Most recently, the global compute has involved offloading systemic precarity onto individuals, and where possible, onto entire peoples, to the point just reached in 2020, when that strategy itself created radical systemic instability, causing deaths that will likely be in the millions, and not incidentally, threatening global depression. Well, one person's or one people's Armageddon is another's depression, or their joy. The algorithmic optimization of society for profit, an economics that, while sometimes unconscious, is these days never too far from the conscious mind of the creators of specific programs, collectively affects a wholesale compression of the socio-semiotic into what Friedrich von Hayek precisely called a system of telecommunications, capacitated by what he grasped as effectively the price signal. So I'll say more about that in a little while, but this notion of Hayek's that the pricing system was a system of telecommunications has become really important in my thinking. It was also a system of computational system. Money, or what in a different key Alfred Sloan Rethel perceived as exhibit A of real abstraction, relegates, wherever possible, everything else to noise. The noise, of course, is the source of volatility. The suppression of noise is, from the standpoint of communication theory, a technical matter. Here we understand it as a matter of politics and economy. Noise suppression directly correlates to people's oppression. In financial terms, volatility is a similar index, the expression in prices of decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. Ironic then that volatility has become a major source of value creation for synthetic finance and now for states. The US Corona bailouts of over $3 trillion US, responses to the volatility of the social rendered ever more precarious by the existing economy, represent more than 60% of the money ever issued in the history of the country. So monetary issuance and financialization, the making of money, becomes a direct response to volatility that is social unrest. What perhaps best characterized this period is a full-blown convergence of communication, information, and financialization as computation. Whether or not this convergence and all its incipient violence can be redesigned is an open question. This question is ultimately about a possible politics of the protocolization of these informatic networks within a literally universal system of computation that, as hypostatic states, looks like a virtual machine, what I here call the world computer, and as a diachronic flow or processing is nothing less than economic media. Can these formations that for their proprietors profitably collapse message and value be hacked or reprogrammed so that the command control centers that make the most from difference are not in the hands of racist plutocrats, do not in fact produce them? That question, though addressed in this volume, will be taken up more fully at a later date with a particular focus on the how and the who, and that'll be the economic media book. Here in this book, we consider the various social vectors and components sedimented into machine function and then reactivated by the dire co-articulation of racial capitalism and computation, rearticulated as computational racial capitalism and its virtual machine, the world computer. So this is a section called Information as Real Abstraction. It's also from the introduction. Taking the notion that capital is always a computer as a starting point, and take that from Nick Dyer-Witherford, the world computer understands the history of commodification of life as a process of encrypting the world's myriad qualities as quantities. Formal and informal techniques, from double entry bookkeeping and racialization to the rise of information and discrete state machines, imposed and extended the tyranny of racial capital's relentless calculus of profit. By means of the violent colonization of almost all social spaces, categories, and representations, where today language, image, music, and communication all depend upon a computational substrate that is an outgrowth of fixed capital, all or nearly all expressivity has been captured in the dialectic of massive capital accumulation on the one side and radical dispossession on the other. Currently, the money likeness of expression, visible as likes, and in other attention metrics that treat attention and affect as currency, is symptomatic of the financialization of daily life, as Randy Martin called it. All expression, no matter what its valence, is conscripted by algorithms of profit that intensify inequality by being put in the service of racial capitalism. Consequently, we are experiencing a near apocalyptic world-scale failure to be able to address the global crisis, including migration for reparations, carceral systems, genocide, militarism, climate racism, pandemic, anti-Blackness, extinction, and other geopolitical ills. The colonization of semiotics by racial capitalism has rendered all democratic modes of governance outmoded, save those designed for the violent purpose of extracting profits for the enfranchised. Culturally, these modes of extraction take the form of fractal fascism. And I have a lot to say about fractal fascism in the body of the book. Basically, it is a fractalization of the celebrity form, right? Where one's persona persona is produced through the accumulation of the attention of audiences of various sizes. So in the subsumption of other people's attention, other people's lifetime or life power, one becomes someone. And the fractalization of this relationship is kind of the way in which we are able to appear socially in dominant media forms. An understanding that informationalized semiotic practices function as financial derivatives may allow for a reimagining of the relationship between language, visuality, and that other economic medium, namely money, in an attempt to reprogram economy and therefore the creation and distribution of value, and thus also the politics and potentials of representation, which right now are increasingly bankrupt, in what would amount to an end for radical politics. In what would amount to an end to postmodernism, understood as the cultural logic of late capitalism, our revolutionary politics require, as did the communisms of the early 20th century, a new type of economic program. In the age of computation, putting political economy back on the table implies a reprogramming of our cultural logics as economic media for a radical redress of the ills of exploitation and the democratization of the distribution of the world's social product. Sustainable communism requires the decolonization of abstraction and the remaking of the protocols of social practice that give rise to real abstraction. Those are kind of very impacted terms. I'm only going to be marginally useful in really unpacking them, but hopefully you'll hold them in your mind and we can talk about them afterwards, or maybe they'll do their work as time goes by if they're not immediately obvious. Though in this section, we will more narrowly address the issues of money, race, and information as real abstraction and their role in computational racial capitalism, we note the overarching argument for the larger study. And I decided to put those on the screen in a set of slides for you all. Let's see. I'm just going to check back for 1 second. Everybody's still here, right?
Yes, we're here.
Okay, good. No, it's uncanny. I mean, I feel like I'm talking to myself, and but I'm very aware that there are other people there. But then I was like, are they? Okay.
We're here. We're hosts, but we're very present.
Thank you. That's great. Okay, so let me go back to this this share here. So these are some of these 6 points that I wanted to make, which are part of the larger argument, just to give you the context. Commodification inaugurates the global transformation of qualities into quantities and gives rise to the world computer. And what I have in mind here is the process of basically the quantification of everything through the process of production for the market, where any quality, whatever, can be indexed by a price. So I see this this digitization actually as having a very long history and a very important one, and also maybe one that hasn't quite been plumbed in the way that it needs to be, because one of the things that was naturalized in this process of digitization was information. That information was just somehow like, trees or solar systems, that it was just there. And what I'm suggesting is that there's a historical arc to the emergence of information as a process of inscription and as a modality of relation. So I want to locate the emergence of this in commodification itself. Oops. There we go. So real abstraction is the ontology of information is the kind of larger title for the second point. Information is not a naturally occurring reality, but emerges in the footprint of price and is always a means to posit the price of, I can't read my own screen here, sorry, of a possible or actual product. Now I realize this is going to be a difficult claim to just sort of like swallow all at once, and it's in a way it's one of the wages of the book to make good on this claim. But I'm asking people to begin to think anyway of information as a kind of derivative, right? Which actually always requires a registration process in a social armature. And so once you have a social armature which is capable of putting on a ledger or an algorithm writing that indexes some social phenomenon, then you're always already in the social. One doesn't sort of like, disappear and perceive information. It's not object-oriented ontology, right? I mean, there's a social relation implicit in the creation of any information. Okay, trying to get to number 3 here. I think I can do that. There we go. So information is a modality of extraction. And in the text, I continue what I did in the Messages of Murder, which is trying to rewrite the general formula for capital MCM prime, where money is money, where M is money, C is commodity, and M prime is more money. I'm trying to rewrite that as MIM prime, where I is information. This is kind of a complex claim with a lot of consequences. You probably remember from your Marx and your Marxism that in the creation of the commodity, and classically in wage labor, the worker performs necessary labor and surplus labor, which is all sedimented into the commodity. When the commodity is sold, the profit, the M prime, which is greater than M, comes from that unpaid, that labor that's not paid for, the surplus labor by the worker. I'm making an argument that this actually happens in information now, and that information can be reduced to the commodity form, but has more capabilities than what we normally think of as the commodity when we think of it as an object. And that information is now the means to M prime. And so a significant question obviously becomes, well, if that's really true, where's the exploitation, right? Where and how does extraction take place? And that's particularly important since the world is increasingly informatic and computation is ubiquitous and hash rates are infinitely increasing and colonizing time. So this role of information and the way in which it extracts value is one of the key questions of the book, and it's something that I explore in detail. Transformation of labor. Labor, attention, cognition, metabolism, life converges to informatic labor, whose purpose with respect to capital is to create state changes in the universal Turing machine that is the world computer. Racial capital's relentless, granular, and planetary computation of its accounts. And the aspect of racial capitalism and the aspect of social difference is also an absolutely essential component in my understanding of the emergence of this virtual machine called the world computer, because it's precisely in this process of differentiation that and the discounting of life that value is extracted. So the codification process, which goes into these seemingly cultural forms of knowing, like race and gender, to me has an algorithmic function and a very complex algorithmic function. The generalization of computation results in this colonization of the socio-semiotic and what I call the derivative condition. Semiotics, representation, and categories of social difference function as financial derivatives, as wagers on the economic value of their underliers, and as a means of structuring risk for capital. That's an argument I probably won't get to say too much about right now, but one can think of this in terms of social derivatives and maybe your practices on Instagram or social media, where in many ways are structured as wagers. I mean, how do you get something more out of social volatility? How do you kind of enter into an informatic space in order to create a vector where you can get a return of some kind? We're all sort of forced into these, creating these socio-semiotic wagers, right? These, what I think of as derivatives. But the platforms themselves are the market makers for that. They're actually collecting surplus value from absolutely every one of these undertakings. So only a direct engagement with the computational colonization of the life world through a reprogramming or remaking of material processes of abstraction that constitute real abstraction can secure victory in the form of a definitive step out of and away from racial capitalism for the progressive movements of our times. Such a definitive movement requires an occupation and decolonization of information, and therefore of computation, and therefore of money. Only through a remaking of social relations at the molecular level of their calculus, informed by a struggle against oppression, can the beauty of living and the fugitive legacies of creativity, community, and care prevail. So I was gonna, this is going a little slower than I had planned, but I'm gonna read a little bit more and probably interrupt myself before I expected in order to just make a few closing remarks. But I want to take you through a little bit of the stuff on real abstraction and racial abstraction, because I think it's really significant to see that these are, that it's practices, social practices, forms of exchange, and also forms of violence that create our abstract categories. It's not an idealistic notion that these categories pre-exist, right? It's in fact, these are the result of social practices and social relations. And then in the codification process, they become a layer of discernment in a larger computational analysis, which is ultimately looking for return on investment. Sorry. Okay. The mode of comprehension, analysis, and transformation proposed here will require an expanded notion of racial capitalism. It interrogates the existence of deep continuities and long-term emergences, what one could correctly call algorithms of extractive violence in the history of capitalism. These algorithms of violence include the reading and writing of codes on bodies, their surveillance and overcoding by informatic abstraction. Such algorithms are executed on the flesh, to use Spiller's term. And they are executed by means of codification, a codification process that violently imposes both the metaphysical and physical reformatting of bodies. And here I have in mind, for example, Simone Brown's amazing work in Dark Matters, and her looking at these media technologies, the technologies of inscription, which include brands and the design of slave ships, newspaper advertisements for runaways, for trying to recapture fugitives, all these different techniques which are involved in epidermalization. And Brown develops this in relationship to Stuart Hall's work and also to Frantz Fanon. But this process of epidermalization, Brown already sees as a process of codification. And I'm trying to understand that as coming on a continuum with a general inscription of code on absolutely everything in order to do the calculus that is capital. Executable code is imposed as social categories of race, gender, religion, and property, as ideologies, psychologies, communication theories, game theories, and quantities of money. These abstractions work their way into and are indeed imposed by the machines of calculation. It is a continuous process of unmaking and remaking using all means available that is violently inscribed on bodies. Sylvia Wynter, in her post-Rodney King piece, No Humans Involved, an open letter to my colleagues, writes, quote, both W.E.B. Du Bois and Elsa Govia have emphasized the way in which the code of race on the color line functions to systemically predetermine the sharply unequal redistribution of the collectively produced global resources, and therefore the correlation of the racial ranking rule with the rich-poor rule. Govea pointed out that all American societies are integrated on the basis of a central cultural belief in which all share. This belief, that of the genetic racial inferiority of Black people to all others, functions to enable our social hierarchies, including those of rich and poor, determined directly by the economic system, to be perceived as having been as predetermined by that great crap game called life, as have also ostensibly been the invariant hierarchy between white and Black. Consequently, in the Caribbean and Latin America, within the terms of this socio-symbolic calculus, to be rich was to be white, to be poor was also to be Black. That's Wynter. To be rich was also to be white, to be poor was also to be Black. The real abstraction imposed by executable code, the code of race that functions to systematically predetermine the structurally unequal redistribution of global resources, is beholden to mediating capitalist exchange while embarking on a radical reformatting of ontology. This reformatting, the supposed result of that great crap game called life, brutally correlates race and value, but not entirely by chance, while racial capitalism embarks on imposing this calculus globally. Racial abstraction is endemic to what we will further explore as real abstraction. The evacuation of quality by abstract categories and quantities is, as we shall see in more detail, a quote unquote necessary correlate to a world overrun by the calculus of money. Such algorithms of violence encode social difference, and although they may begin as heuristics, they are nonetheless crucial to the calculated and calculating expansion of racial capital. Its processes and processing structures the meanings that can be ascribed to, and as importantly, what can be done to those of us whose data profiles constitute us as illegal, Mexican, Black, Gypsy, Jew, and the lexicon of thousands of other actionable signs. This codification process draws from the histories of slavery, of colonialism, of state formation, of genocide, of gender oppression, of religious pogroms, of normativity, and again from the militarization and policing and the apparatuses of calculation that have developed within states and parastates in their own biometric pursuit of capital power. Their violent destruction and remaking of the world. The internalization of these codes, including the struggles with them and the ways in which they license and or foreclose various actions, exists in a recursive relationship to their perilous refinement. And that's also what I mean about struggle, right? I mean, the resistance and revolutionary activity, forms of revolt, disobedience of many kinds, exit, one's contest the categories and also create occasions for their refinement. Their analysis, a code breaking of sorts, will therefore demand some drastic modifications in many of the various anti-capitalist, anti-state warrior stances practiced to date, particularly in a large number of their European and US incarnations that until very recently remain blind to their own imperial violence and are too often complicit with hegemonic codes of masculine, unraced agency, imperialist nationalism, and default liberal assumptions in relation to questions of race, gender, sexuality, coloniality, and other forms of historically institutionalized oppression. The analytic computational racial capital would identify the field of operations that emerges around the embryonic form of the commodity and co-articulates with racial abstraction to formalize its code that serves as operating system for the virtual machine here hypothesized as the world computer, and by inscribing itself on bodies and everything else. The commodity, the analysis of which famously begins volume 1 of Marx's Capital, expressed the dual being and indeed dual registration of the humanly informed object as both quality of matter and quantity of exchange value, along with the global generalization of this form. Quote, the wealth of societies is the capitalist mode of production, quote, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities, unquote. Commodities were, and with some modifications to be discussed further on, still are, humanly informed materials with a use value and an exchange value, humanly informed qualities indexed by quantities. Computational racial capital as a heuristic device stages an analysis of the convergence of what, on the one side, often appeared as universal, the economic, abstract, and machine operating systems of global production and reproduction, endemic to the commodity form and its calculus, with what, on the another side, sometimes appeared as a particular or even incidental, racism, colonialism, slavery, imperialism, racialization. The concept of organizes this dramaturgy of analytically reunifying elements that were never materially separate in light of the study that the late Cedric Robinson conducted and recorded as Black Marxism. Robinson writes, quote, the development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued essentially racial directions, so too did social ideology. As a material force then, it could be expected that racialism would inevitably permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism. I have used the term racial capital to refer to the development and to the subsequent structure as a historical agency, unquote. The world computer takes what Robinson saw as, quote, civilizational racism, unquote, and its central role in the development of capital is axiomatic, and sees that this role extends to and deeply into capitalist calculation and machinery during the entire period in which the world economic system seems to have moved from the paradigm of the commodity to the paradigm of information. Computational racial capitalism would thus understand the generalization of computation as an extension of capital logics and practices that include and indeed require the economic calculus of the dialectics of social difference. These differences, both economic and semiotic, would include those applied by slavery, anti-Blackness, and other forms of racism during the past centuries. Computation must therefore be recognized as not a mere technical emergence, but the practical result of an ongoing and bloody struggle between the would-have-it-alls and the to be dispossessed. Developed both consciously and unconsciously, computational racial capital is, when seen in the light of ongoing racialization and value extraction, the subsequent structure of a historical agency. The racial logic of computation must be pursued when considering finance, surveillance, population management, policing, social systems, social media, or any of the vast suite of protocols applying difference for capital. The social instance of computation, a specific 1 or 0, may seem value neutral, as indifferent as lead for a bullet or uranium for a bomb. But we are looking at computation as the modality of a world system. Computation emerges as the result of struggles that informed class struggle in all its forms, recognized or not by the often spotty traditions of Marxism, including those struggles specific to antagonisms of colonialism, slavery, imperialism, and white supremacist heteropatriarchal capitalism more generally. It is the result of struggles indexed by race, gender, sexuality, nationality, and ethnicity, along with additional terms indexing social differentiation, too numerous to encant here, but that together form a lexicon and a grammar of extractive expression. And as we have said, and must always be remembered, also of struggle. This lexicon includes compressions that result in many of history's abstractions, including a perhaps singularly pointed abstraction, a history whose shorthand is race. It's Spillers. The grammar for that lexicon depends upon the deployment and execution of forms of differentiating abstraction that are lived processes of abstraction and lived abstraction organized by the increasingly complex and variegated calculus of profit and thus of domination.
Jonathan, and you had asked me to let you know when it was around 12:50, so I am doing so.
Right, thank you, thanks. And I had actually planned on reading a little bit more about Son rather than real abstraction, but I think that's enough reading for me and probably for everyone else. So let me just take 5 more minutes if I can, and is it all right? I mean, I don't know what our timeline is here.
Well, I'm sure that some people will leave it at around 1 because they are going to classes.
Okay.
But others will stay and we'll have a longer conversation.
Well, I could stop here, or I could save like three or 4 more minutes of stuff, or just take questions, whatever you think is best, Héctor.
But I'm gonna say let's go with questions also because I want to hear from students. And don't be shy, guys. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this amazing talk and for what promises to be such an important contribution to several bodies of literature. This is interdisciplinary indeed. It is relevant for science and technology studies. It's relevant for cultural studies, for literature, for theory, for a variety of fields. And as people mull over some questions that they might ask, I'm going to react to some of the ideas that you have put forward. The idea of fractal fascism as the capture of someone else's attention to build one's own persona, got me reeling here. And I was thinking of a recent development. What I want to do in this very short response is to relate this to recent phenomena. Okay, try and bring your thoughts to converse with some things that people may have in mind that might be helpful, right, to better understand. And let me share my screen. I think you'll get a kick out of this. This is from McDonald's.com, the official website of McDonald's, and it celebrates the release of the new J Balvin meal. J Balvin, several of you may know, is a famous reggaeton singer who has, we see here, 8.6 million followers on Twitter. And so the McDonald's deal, which means that people will enjoy a McFlurry alongside their burger and evoke J Balvin. Also, it means that T-shirts designed by J Balvin will be given to McDonald's workers who have no choice on the matter. It's part of their job. They have to wear a T-shirt designed by this reggaeton singer, right? This will add to the Twitter followers. So the 8.6 million people expect will take him up to another level in Twitter followers. For instance, Shakira, who happens to have 52 million followers on Twitter, and who is at the top 20. People might recall that the top person on Twitter with the most followers is Barack Obama with 123 million. So talk about scale, fractalization, the capture of someone else's attention to build one's own persona, the scales of 8.6 million, 52 million, 123 million, and the intervention of the actual food supply, as in cows being butchered to produce hamburgers. So the kind of thinking that Jonathan Beller is presenting us with allows you to put something as inane, as banal as J Balvin's endorsement of a hamburger in conversation with the totality, with this Marxist idea of totality, which is kind of hard to grasp unless you have, something like this. Or think of, white supremacist clickbait currently rampant on the internet. Per Jonathan Beller's analysis, this wouldn't be a fluke, but a feature of racial capitalism. And that, flip is just, I think, eye-opening. One could also think of a documentary that I know some of our students have seen, Maquilapolis, which deals with the fact, especially in the 90s, that has changed. It changes very rapidly, but at this one point, California would design the software, and brown women's hands would assemble the hardware just south of the border, okay? So Tijuana, as this NAFTA city, right, producing the labor for all this engineering work up here in California. So it's not like the idea that capital is inscribed in computation is in any ways polemical. I think that, or that racial capital, for that matter, is inscribed in computation. Has anyone here seen in the US a computer disposal site? Most likely no, but this is because this is shipped to the third world, right? And recently China actually closed its borders to computer waste. So those are reactions as to some things that folks might want to relate with ideas such as fractofascism or reverse assumption, protocolization, bias as a substrate for computation, just trying to make it tangible. And I have two questions for you, Jonathan, if I may. Sure. When Black Lives Matter gained traction also on Twitter, because we're engaging with these technologies. There's no way we cannot engage with them. And I by no means mean to vilify J Balvin, whom I actually like, okay, for the record. But when Black Lives Matter is happening on Twitter, and say you are in the Bay Area and people's attention is reaching a limit, okay? This is like a limit of the sensoria with an election, fires, Black Lives Matter, and all of this happening at the same time. I'm just curious, how would you, having thought so much on attention economy and racial capitalism, think of a conjuncture like that, of that moment in time? And then my second question, coming from a program on modern thought and literature, is, in light of everything that you've described, what can literature be today?
Second one's hard. the first one's hard too. But I'll thanks for that, Hector. I really appreciate your thoughtful comments and questions. And those examples are really helpful. I mean, thinking about what you said around maquilladoras and racial capitalism. I mean, I think also of Lourdes Portillo's film Señorita Extraviada, and it's the way in which it thinks about femicide. And one of the things that's really clear from that film is that there are very people who are seeking to better themselves through some sort of relationship with capital, like a job in a maquilladora, also is the pathway to extraction onto death, right? So that there is so that there seems to be a very powerful dialectical image, because it's simultaneously, like in a way, the struggle with photography itself, it's a pathway into to self-creation and community creation and benefiting your family for people who take a job for $5 a day, but also you give your labor to capital to build television sets and computers, right? So your very being is incorporated into this project of extension of visual culture and computation, and you're being paid at a discounted rate, right? Because of your nationality, because of the history of colonialism. And that's a form of murder right there, to say nothing of the kind of femicide, which is also part and parcel of that environment. And the being able to take the life of a young person with impunity. So to me, that's sort of is a dialectical image in a very powerful way that speaks to the Black Lives Matter question. Because, you know, I mean, in fact, what's her name? Melissa Wright writes about the maquiladora context and some of the resistance movements around that they were criticized for using the media and sort of effectively advertising strategies to draw attention to it, saying, well, look, you're just like any other capitalist, you're just sensationalists. But, you know, on the other hand, it's like saying, well, if you're against pollution, why are you breathing the air? You know, or go back to go back to your own country. This is the vernacular in which we have to struggle. And so I think that the dissemination of footage which documents police violence, anti-Black violence, anti-Blackness in so many different registers is of extreme importance. I mean, it's radicalizing for me. Although I understand, like from the Saidiya Hartman kind of perspective, not this is her only perspective, that the representation of racial trauma sometimes reactivates it and just intensifies it in a really negative way. I mean, I'm sensitive to that, although I think in the case that you brought up, something else is actually going on in terms of the construction of community and a social base of knowledge, which is now documented. I find that very important. However, I think this is also why we need something like the economic media redesign that I'm talking about, where we actually have to redesign the convergence of computation and communication and capitalization or financialization, because these things are still for-profit vectors for the Zuckerbergs of the world and the platform owners. So when your revolutionary activity, when your radical activity and your radical communication is only producing the antithesis of that desire, which is hierarchy and domination, you have a huge problem. You have a contradiction between two different protocols. The promise of one, which is the internet, which is horizontality, and the actuality, the economic architecture behind it, which is pyramidal or hierarchical. And that's the failure of the internet, in my view. That's the failure of the digital revolution. And of course, after the failure of revolutions, Benjamin told us, what do you get? You get fascism.
Yep, and someone like Alexander Galloway thinking about the protocological control would complement that quite well. But then you're not tackling the other question, right? What is literature today? I mean, I really ask this question, and I have no answer myself. When you know, the book, the analog book, right? I'm looking at just what I have here. Adam Shell-Hor's Anti-Literature. It's a great book. But this has to compete with screens, with pings, with notifications. Is it an antidote? Is it one more thing in this media ecology? Part of the problem, part of the solution? Are you disillusioned with literature? Is it still, you know, inspiring your thought? You know, just any thoughts would be appreciated.
Well, look, you know, I don't know if you know this, but I went to a literature program. I went to the literature program at Duke, and wrote a dissertation on cinema, and then moved my work into visual culture and a field that didn't exist at the time, which is media theory. And now I'm thinking about computation. But why was I interested in literature? Because I was reading a lot of Latin American literature, Global South literature, which was doing precisely the kind of work that I thought was essential, which was creating counter history. You know, creating different structure of affect, creating alternative modalities of being and forms of desire and relation, which I thought were profoundly important. I still think those things are important, and I still think those things are actually being produced in literature and poetry. I mean, poetry is having a huge renaissance here in Brooklyn, but I guess everywhere. And so the role of poesis I think is not lost on us, right? But I feel again that there is a limit to that because of the speed by which these sort of innovations and revolutionary forms are subsumed. And we need to figure out how to protect those things, how to actually make the values that are encoded in literary practice, for example, or in comics, for example, how to make those values actually persistent in an economic space. How do you make those values actually restructure economy? And to me, I didn't get to get into that in my talk at all today, but I'm thinking very seriously about the emergence of a new medium, which I don't want to like kind of like pull the rug out from under myself right now by saying something that everyone's going to think is stupid. But you know, I think about cryptocurrency very seriously as a very misunderstood but emergent medium, something that actually has expressive power because it replatforms money and the community on which money bases its value. However, in my view, cryptocurrency is like what photography was in like 1844, or like what cinema was in 1896. It's super primitive, and it's being taken up by a lot of people who I really don't like. I mean, there's all this libertarian stuff around crypto, which is really awful. But I also think as an emerging medium, as someone who's a film theorist, right, and thought a lot about cinema and screens and the platforming of information, crypto has a lot of very interesting features which are really underexplored.
That's so interesting. Yeah, Venmo is a social media. You know, you find out who is buying pizza from whom. We have a question from one of our students. Mitch, if you wouldn't mind also turning on your screen, that'd be great.
Hello, am I audible, visible?
Yes, Mitch, hi.
Wonderful, hi. Well, I just wanted to thank you first off for such a rich talk. And just like, I mean, it's so clarifying, like, especially because of all of these, I guess you could say, broadly speaking, critiques of certain instances of algorithmic racism that I tend to see in liberal media sources, where it's always kind of expressed in the key of bias. You know, there's this individual algorithm that happens to have these specific biases that have to do with, you know, not the structure of computation itself, but, you know, the individual biases, I guess you could say, of the people.
For the data set.
The data set, from the data set and from the people. Like there's this indexical idea that it's the people who made the algorithm or whatever who are just kind of like making their own biases flow into their product. And I found your argument such a forceful counterpunch to that no, it's the logic of computation itself that's caught up in the logic of racial capitalism. It's not so simple to just find less biased coders. But my question was on a different part of your talk. And I wanted to hear more about something that you said almost kind of offhand. You said at one point, this is an object-oriented ontology. You know, information does in fact represent real relations among people, as I understood you to be saying. And I was just wondering, like, because you talk very, very compellingly about this ever wider spread of and intensification of this computational logic of transmuting quality into quantity. And I'm wondering if is there a way in which one could read, or you could read, recent intellectual developments like OOO and like this kind of resurgence in interest in autonomy among art critics and literary critics as kind of this attempt to create some sort of bulwark against that conversion of quality into quantity, kind of like carving out a space where this computational logic can't access, can't touch, and then whether in turn you think that those efforts to construct this kind of space of withdrawal free from computation and its clutches is in itself kind of implicated in those logics that it's trying to resist.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks. My kind of superficial reading of OOO, which is, I mean it seriously, I haven't really spent a lot of time with OOO because of the texts that I have looked at don't excite me. so take this with a grain of salt, please. But I mean, I see that as an attempt to evade capture for sure, but really an attempt to evade the capture of critical race theory and feminist theory, right, and even post-structuralism, honestly. So that these are ways to sort of license smuggling back in the right for certain subjects to continue speaking in a way that's uncontested, and white men basically, and so I feel like that really is a very conservative movement overall. I hope I'm not offending anybody too much, or if I am, it's in a good way. I'm not really. I don't know if I can argue much more than that here, but that's my take. And I do think there's a lot of other efforts, some of them to me more interesting, for exit and kind of fugitive practices, which would evade the granular resolution of informationalization. Unfortunately, though, oftentimes once we know about them, it's too late. It's kind of like Kafka saying, "There's hope, but not for us." We by the sheer fact that we're on this Zoom call, are obviously quite invested in informatics and capitalism. So my question is always, what are the revolutionary strategies? What has to happen? And just to go back to your first point for 1 second about bias and the algorithm, which I thought was really interesting also. For me, it's like, I don't want to contradict or negate some of the really important work that's been done on recognizing that algorithms are biased. I mean, Joy Bulamwini, for example, who I cite in my text, or Ruha Benjamin, or Safia Majid Nobel. I mean, people who have done a lot of really important work to recognize the way in which bias is encoded into existing computation. That's, to me, that's all right. But is the answer to sort of make a more liberal and supposedly racially uninflected computation? So I mean, Bulamwini, for example, who's at MIT, I think she's finished now, but she was she said, well, let's just redesign facial recognition software so that it recognizes everybody equally. Is that really what we want? I mean, do we all want to be in the database? It really depends upon how that information is going to be used and who has control of it. Right now, we have very little control of this because it's all centralized structures, right? And there are lots of legal and computational formatting processes which privatize that information and control access to that information. So we don't, even though we're all producing it, very few of us have access to its power.
Thank you so much.
Other questions or comments? Thanks, Mitch. Everyone is here still, which signals great interest, and yet the questions are not forthcoming, which is also okay. But let me, yeah, a comment about OOO. Won't talk about this too much, but I find real potential in articulating historical and null materialism. I think, that's one direction where there could be exciting findings awaiting. When Latour does this thing about understanding Prussia by looking at a Berlin key, even though he chooses to forget everything as that will become like the rise of fascism and many like social and cultural dimensions. When you also factor in what he does with the key and bring in the rest, something great can result from that more like hybrid heterogeneous methodology. I mean, we're still struggling, I feel, to find a methodology that does justice to the technological revolution, understanding that technology doesn't exist, that the internet doesn't exist, that we are in the realm of the socio-technical. But it's kind of like a playing catch game sometimes with developments that for which we ourselves are part of the beta test. They're beta testing with us, and then we also have to try and think critically about this. What I'd like to suggest is, in Zoom, I find that great things are even better when they're short. And it would be my desideratum that we could all go out in the terrace room and share lunch, and enjoy the lovely weather. But But instead, as Lacanians that we're all becoming, we might just cut this one short and send everyone home. But I really want to thank you, Jonathan, for being with us today. I'd like to thank everyone for coming, for staying, for showing up, for conquering Zoom fatigue in the interest of learning, as we all have done. Amy, if you wouldn't mind hitting the pause recording button.
Can I just say one more thing before we quit?
Yes.
I'm going to stop recording, but I would like to invite anybody who didn't feel like talking at all